Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm talking about the trial in 1859 of John Brown, that some people think caused, or at least led to, the American Civil War. Whether it did or didn't, it is one of the most important trials of the 19th century, and it certainly defined what that war was about. So far in this series, I've been talking about the trials of people who, by the time they reached the courtroom, different kinds of courtrooms, were already world historical figures, or if not that, at least within their own nations or within their own time. Really, really significant people. Socrates. Joan of Arc, she was a nobody, but by the time she was on trial, she was probably the most famous woman in Christendom. Queens. Mary Queen of Scots, kings, Charles I, Louis XVI. Thomas More, when he went on trial, all of Europe was watching. Even Warren Hastings, not much known now, when his trial started, he was one of the dominant figures of the age, not so much, by the time it ended 7 years later. But the person I'm talking about today was very well known before his trial, but he wasn't a world historical figure. Even within his own nation, the United States, he was one of many people who were making the news, one might say, making a difference. But it was his trial, the event that precipitated it, the trial itself, and what followed his trial, that made him a central figure of his time, and in some ways a central figure ever since. One of the most important people of the 19th century. So it was the trial that did it, and that makes this story a bit different from the other stories I've been telling. And in particular, not just the trial, but some of the things that were said during the trial. Above all, a speech that John Brown himself gave after he'd been convicted, which is one of the great speeches of American history. It's not that John Brown himself was a nobody before he was put on trial. He was a remarkable person, and almost everyone who met him before 1849, in the first 59 years of his life, was struck almost straight away that he was an extraordinary person. He was very, very memorable. He was known to be extremely personally brave, courageous. He was fearsome. He was very self-sufficient. He was very, very committed to his cause. His cause was the abolition of slavery. He was an abolitionist. He was deeply religious, a born-again Christian. As a teenager, he had found Christ, found the Bible. It was that strain of Christianity that was strongly influenced by what's called transcendentalism, and it put a great emphasis on the power of the individual, the ability of an individual to create a moral universe, and John Brown believed that. He was a patriarch. He was twice married, once widowed, twice married. He had 20 children with his two wives. Of those 20 children, 9 died in childhood of childhood diseases. 3 of his children, 3 of his sons, died with him fighting slavery. They were martyrs to the cause. He didn't just martyr himself, he martyred his own children. 8 outlived him. So he was a patriarch who expected his children to join him in the righteous fight. All of these things made him a very, very distinctive person, but not unique in mid-19th century America. His deep religiosity, his self-sufficiency, his personal courage, the fact that he was a patriarch of a great brood, a clan, who were expected to do what their father required of him. This was 19th century America. This was frontier America. There were people like that, and he was one. His abolitionism was very pronounced, and he became known for it. And it was violent, militant abolitionism. He took the fight to the slave owners and the defenders of slavery. And in the mid-1850s, that fight, this is before the Civil War, the proxy war was happening in Kansas, a fight over whether Kansas would be slave or free the state. And Kansas was swamped with people from both sides of that argument, people defending the institution of slavery, people determined to keep slavery out of Kansas. John Brown went to Kansas and he joined the fight, literally. He killed some of the pro-slavery agitators in the state. He murdered them. He said it was self-defense, but he and his sons went on a notorious raid in which a number of slave defenders, not slave owners at this point, but men who'd come to the state in the name of slavery, were killed. And he was known for that. And in some ways, it was a miracle that John Brown himself survived these brutal struggles going on in Kansas. It was extraordinarily violent. You could get away with murder in that state because everybody thought that the stakes were that high. John Brown became a national figure in a way at the end of 1858. He was a pretty old man by this point, in his late 50s, when he and a small group of his followers did an incredibly daring raid in Missouri in which they freed a small group of slaves and smuggled them to Canada, got them north and got them to safety, and then publicized the event. It spooked the slave owners. It greatly enthused the opponents of slavery, and John Brown became a small but significant symbol of taking the fight to slavery. He believed his job on this earth, in a country where many people had the role of slave catcher, was to be a slave freer. His job, wherever he could, however he could, using whatever means he could, including the means of righteous violence, was to free slaves from their captivity. And when he did it successfully at the end of 1858, he was celebrated and reviled. He was a long-standing participant in the Underground Railroad, that informal but actually semi-formal network of people and places through which and out of which fugitive slaves could be smuggled north, as far north as possible. The further north, the safer. Canada may be safest of all. Brown was involved in that. He was an acquaintance, not a friend, but an acquaintance, a good acquaintance, of the best-known former slave in America, Frederick Douglass. So Brown was a significant figure in 1850s America, but there were a number of significant figures in 1850s America in different ways playing roles in this proxy conflict. The country wasn't yet at war with itself, but it also was, not formally, but informally. And there were many people fighting the struggle in different ways, in Congress, in politics. Abraham Lincoln at this point was one of them, but many, many others in the South, in the North. And John Brown had made himself a figure in this struggle, but not a defining figure. What defined him was his trial and the events leading up to his trial. Through 1858 into 1859, Brown wanted to accelerate the fight, amplify it, and he conceived a scheme which would involve some of his children, some of his followers, including a number of his black followers. John Brown, throughout his life, was friends with people of color. He mingled with, moved with, interacted with people of color in a way that was properly ecumenical, egalitarian. He was literally the opposite of a racist, which in 19th century America is incredibly rare, not unique, but incredibly rare. This group would capture a federal armory at a place called Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, where there were arms, enough arms that if they could get those arms into the hands of nearby slaves, those slaves could use those weapons to break free. That was the plan. And the hope was that large numbers of those slaves would take up these arms once they'd been liberated from the armory, and they would use them to liberate themselves, and it would become a kind of movement, a snowball effect. The weapons could be shared, passed around, and a sort of army of slaves would emerge to free themselves and then free others. This was meant to be a mass emancipation event, but it had to start with an act of capture and violence, which was to capture the place where the weapons were. And to start with, it went quite well. 21 men with John Brown, 5 of them black, 3 free black men, 1 former slave, now freed, 1 fugitive slave. Some of John Brown's sons were part of this party and others too. And they captured Harper's Ferry. They took hostages. They let it be known in the local countryside that these arms were now available, guns and pikes were available, and slaves should come and gather these things. They should get away from their farms and plantations. Slaves were not under permanent lock and key, and they should come and arm themselves. But it didn't happen. It turned out that for the slaves that heard this news, the few that heard this news, it sounded deeply suspicious. Completely understandably, anyone who was enslaved in West Virginia would be very wary of being told, go to this place, arm yourself, liberate yourself. It sounded like a trap. If you were a slave, you had learned to look any gift horse in the mouth because it's probably going to bite your head off. So what Brown hoped would happen didn't happen. Instead, what happened is news spread very quickly, much more quickly than to the enslaved local community, to the armed white slaveholding local community, that he'd taken Harper's Ferry. And a militia was formed very quickly to take it back, to capture him, and if necessary, to kill him and his followers. In the end, this militia came under the command of Robert E. Lee, who was in the area, the man who would go on to command the Confederate forces in the Civil War. Brown was cut off. He and his supporters were trapped. There was no means of escape. All they could do was fight. He fought very bravely. One of his sons died more or less in his arms. Many of his followers died on the day. He was very badly wounded. The hostages were freed. The arms were retaken. And Brown was taken into captivity, not dead, but very severely injured. Once he had been captured, before his trial, which was coming, he gave a series of remarks, including an interview to a local newspaper in which he was asked, what were you doing? What were you thinking? Was this an attempted uprising? Were you trying to create a slave uprising? And he answered by saying, first of all, when asked, that he was disappointed. Not that he had been captured, not that it had ended in bloodshed. I think he thought it would always end in bloodshed, but that the call that had gone out to the enslaved hadn't been answered. He was disappointed that his act hadn't precipitated a liberation movement or even moment in West Virginia or anywhere else. He didn't say he was disappointed in the slaves who didn't answer his call, but he was disappointed that they hadn't answered his call. He also said that he saw no need for a trial. A trial would be a mockery. He said, spare me the mockery of a trial. You have me. You want my blood, take my blood. You want my life, you can have my life. I know I'm going to die because of this, but spare me the mockery of a trial. But he did also offer a defense before the trial in these interviews, one interview in particular, in which he was asked, you were trying to cause a slave uprising. This was an act of insurrection. It was an act of insurrection against law, against the rule of law. And he said, no, it wasn't. I am not an insurrectionist. I am not an anarchist. I am not a revolutionary. I am in the business of freeing slaves because slavery is immoral. And to be enslaved is to be in a state from which you are entitled and I am entitled to do anything necessary to ensure your freedom. So that's what I was doing. It's not an insurrection, it's an emancipation. And they're different because an emancipation of people who are unjustly imprisoned, enslaved, trapped, in chains, it will require the sort of thing that I did. It's going to require violence. But it's violence in the name of freeing these people, not in the name of overturning or bringing down the state, the rule of law. In a weird way, that defense is a version, a distant cousin, of the defense that Mary Queen of Scots attempted at her trial, and before her trial more than at her trial, like Brown, before the trial itself. Mary Queen of Scots' view as a prisoner in England under Elizabeth I, a queen imprisoned, is that, of course, by natural law, by justice, she had the right to do whatever she needed to do to escape. And that might involve violence. It might involve armed men coming to liberate her. What she was not involved in was a conspiracy against the state. She tried to distinguish between her doing whatever was necessary to emancipate herself from her intolerable situation and working actively with others who wanted to, in this case, murder the Queen. John Brown said, if you're a slave, you must be entitled to do whatever you can do under the overarching principle of natural or divine justice to liberate yourself. And in trying to help such people be liberated, I was simply doing what I had to do by natural or divine justice. That doesn't mean we were trying to overthrow the state. Didn't work for Mary Queen of Scots. It wasn't going to work here. It was going to be harder to run that argument in this case than in the case of a queen. These were not kings and queens. These were slaves. No one in the South thought that slaves had the right, by natural or divine justice, to do whatever was necessary to emancipate themselves from their enslavement. And the line between doing whatever is necessary and overthrowing the established order would be very hard to draw, because in that newspaper interview they said, but you stole and you shot and you took whatever you needed. You didn't respect the laws of property. You didn't respect the laws of persons. And John Brown said, well, no, because in this kind of struggle, you have to do what you have to do. So if the defense was this wasn't an insurrection, it was simply a liberation movement, he probably knew the response would be, what's the difference? Was the trial, as Brown thought it would be, a mockery? Not quite, in the sense that he was tried in West Virginia, and there was a jury, and witnesses were called. There were lawyers on both sides. There was a judge. It looked like a trial that followed something close to recognized procedure. The witnesses didn't seem to have been coerced, and John Brown said that, as we will see, that he thought the witnesses were treated relatively fairly. So it certainly looked like maybe not a fair trial, but recognizably a trial of the kind that people would expect in a case like this. But it also came very close to farce. It took place in a courtroom where the gallery of people up top watching down, what was sometimes still is called, the peanut gallery, actually threw peanut shells down onto the floor at John Brown. John Brown himself, throughout the trial, because he was so badly injured, had to lie down. So he was lying down, not telling the truth, throughout the trial, including whenever he made a statement himself. And at various points, because he was covered with a sheet or a blanket, he simply pulled it over his face to signal he couldn't bear to listen anymore. The prosecuting lawyers included a man who early on, it was clear, was so drunk he had to be replaced. Brown's lawyers, the lawyers that he'd been given, he had to replace himself. At one point, he demanded that the trial be stopped, and it was stopped for a day so that different lawyers could be found for John Brown, because his initial lawyers wanted to defend him by saying he was insane. They wanted to plead insanity. And the one thing that John Brown was not going to do was plead insanity. So his lawyers had to be replaced. And the new lawyers that he got did try to offer a defense. So at the end of the trial, they tried to claim that Brown was not guilty of treason, which was one of the charges against him. And the defense had three strands to it. The first was, this can't be treason held in West Virginia because he's not a citizen of West Virginia. This is not a federal case. So if you're going to charge him with treason, he has to be a citizen of this state. But the response to that was, he brought treason to our state. We're going to try him here. The second line of defense was the one that Brown had attempted in that newspaper interview, which was to distinguish between this as an attempt to liberate people who were enslaved from some kind of attempt to foment a civil uprising or even a civil war. And Brown's lawyer said there is a difference between these two things. There is no evidence that John Brown was in the business of trying to promote across the South the kind of event that would overturn the possibility of there being law in the South. He was simply in the place that he found himself, among the people who were nearby, doing what he could, as he had done before, to liberate those slaves whom he could liberate. That is not treason. It might be a whole range of things, including in West Virginia, crimes against property, but it's not treason. Treason means, as we heard in the case of Aaron Burr, taking war to the United States of America, or in this case, taking war to the state of West Virginia. But then the third line of defense was the people who died in this incident weren't murdered because this was some kind of military encounter. Look, Robert E. Lee was on the other side. So it should be judged not as some kind of civil event, but actually by the terms that we might judge a battle in a war. And in a battle, in a war, we don't charge people with murder. But of course, that line of defense was slightly at odds with the earlier one, which is this wasn't an attempt to create an insurrection. It was just an attempt to liberate slaves. And the version of the argument that Brown tried to run in that newspaper interview, which is, to free slaves, you have to do whatever you have to do. And that might end up looking a bit like an act of war, meant in the end, this wasn't a defense that was going to persuade anybody, not in that courtroom. And it didn't. The jury was sent out, they considered their verdict for 45 minutes, and they found Brown guilty of these capital offences, which meant that he would be sentenced to death. Brown knew it. He knew it from the start. Spare me your trial. You want my blood, take it. The reason that John Brown's trial is so important, so significant, is not because of the defence that he tried to mount. It's because of two other things, one that happened before that formal defence and one that happened after. The thing that happened before is before he fired his lawyer for pleading insanity on his behalf, his lawyer had tried to introduce into the court a document which he said proved John Brown's insanity. It was a document that Brown had drafted with others in 1858. It had been drafted at a meeting of Black Americans and Canadians in Canada, and it was a new constitution for the United States of America. Brown came up with his own version of the American Constitution, and his lawyer produced it in the court to say anyone who wrote this is clearly insane, and Brown wasn't going to have that. But his lawyer clearly thought that this document, were anyone to read it, would obviously be the work of someone who was delusional. I mean, not just the thought that John Brown could redraft the American Constitution, could take the place of America's founders, but the actual content of the Constitution looked mad. Well, if you read it now, it doesn't look mad. It is one of the most remarkable political documents of the age. And it's not like any other constitution I have ever read. So it is quite weird. It's not mad, but it is quite weird. And some of the provisions in it look a little quaint, to put it mildly. So, for instance, it tries to mimic the US Constitution. In Brown's version of America, there will be a president and a vice president and a Supreme Court, and there will be a Congress. But this Congress will consist of between 5 and 10 individuals. So he's thinking quite small scale here. And he reforms various of the rules of the American Constitution, including all office holders will simply serve for 3 years, president, Senate, the rest. That's not what makes it so striking. What makes it so striking is the very first clause in the Constitution, because it says that this is a constitution for all Americans, black, white, free, enslaved, therefore to be free. All Americans are covered by this Constitution, but it also says, insofar as they are willing to uphold this Constitution. I'm just going to read the opening clause of John Brown's Constitution for the United States of America. All persons of mature age, whether proscribed, oppressed, and enslaved citizens, or of the proscribed, oppressed races of the United States, who shall agree to sustain and enforce the provisional constitution and ordinances of this organization, together with all minor children of such persons, shall be held to be fully entitled to protection under the same. All persons, including the oppressed, will be protected by this Constitution if they uphold this Constitution. So this is not a constitution like most constitutions, which says everyone in this land has these rights, and this Constitution will be enacted and ratified by asking these people if they want this Constitution. So through various processes, through their representatives, a Constitution is ratified by an act of endorsement. This is a living Constitution in the sense that it only covers you insofar as you're willing to defend it. And therefore, by implication, if you are not willing to defend a Constitution that includes the rights of all Americans, including the oppressed and enslaved races, you are an outlaw. Which means that this Constitution, as well as being a Constitution, is a declaration of war, because it is saying everybody who does not abide by the principles of this Constitution is an enemy of this Constitution. So when you read the Constitution, it actually looks more like the organization of an army. It's mainly about in this new America, how the armed forces will be managed, controlled, paid for, who will be in, who will be out, who will be in charge. In this version, the president is not the commander-in-chief. This is a constitution that knows, were it to be enacted, that many Americans, including many Americans in the South and some in the North, would not abide by its principles. And therefore, this is a constitution designed to organize a body which would take the fight to these people. This is a declaration of war. It's also weird in other ways. It's very puritanical. It reflects John Brown's personality. Sunday school is required by the terms of this Constitution, which is not true of the Constitution, the actual Constitution of the United States of America. It's got a lot of stuff in it about the values, the moral values, the Christian values, by implication, not explicitly, that need to be upheld, including family values. There's a line towards the end that looks quite sinister. It looks like almost a parody of sort of puritanical intervention into people's lives. It says, "The marriage relation shall be at all times respected, and families kept together as far as possible, and broken families encouraged to reunite, and intelligence offices established for that purpose." Sounds like this new state is going to have offices of snoopers going around seeing where marriages have broken up and forcing the renegades back together. That's not what this means at all. This is a constitution for a nation that will be made up of people who were once enslaved. And one of the many monstrous crimes of slavery is that it broke up families. Husbands, wives, parents, children were separated at slave auctions and sent to different parts of the country. The enslaved were made up of people whose families had been destroyed. This state existed to reunite them. These intelligence offices are simply ways of finding missing persons. This is not monstrous Puritanism. This is visionary and humanistic. The other thing that came out of John Brown's trial that really mattered, this constitution didn't matter, but it signaled something, and it wasn't mad. But the other thing that came out of his trial that really mattered was the speech he made at the end of it. It's a short speech, but quite a lot of it is not particularly memorable. It's Brown engaging with his frustration at the process that he'd been through. But at the heart of his speech are two paragraphs which are roughly the same length as the Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address is just under 300 words. These two paragraphs are just under 300 words. And they are John Brown's Gettysburg Address. This is John Brown's account of why we fight and why in the end we die. And I'm going to read it. John Brown said, "Had I interfered in the manner which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candour of the greater portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right. And every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament. That teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavoured to act up to that instruction. I say I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments. I submit, so let it be done. That line in which he says, I say I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. He says it as a 60-year-old man. He is too young yet to have learned the ways of the world being if you do it for the rich, the powerful, the so-called great, you will be rewarded. But if you do it for the people who, it says in the Bible, are your kin, you will pay with your life. And what John Brown said there was, this will end with blood. And he made that completely clear in his final words. He was very careful to make sure that it was known that he had a final statement just before he was hanged. He said, and he had this broadcast on his behalf, he had it circulated on his behalf, I, John Brown, in his final testament, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. Not just his blood, but other people's blood would be required to be shed, and a lot of it. It's not Lincoln, but it's not a million miles away from Lincoln or where Lincoln ended up. This sin could only be redeemed by blood. The Civil War, I'm sure, produced a lot of great speeches when it came, but there really is only one that is remembered, which is the Gettysburg Address. There were others, including Lincoln's two inaugurals that are often cited and reflected upon, but the Gettysburg Address transcends all of them. John Brown's speech at his trial doesn't quite transcend all the other speeches of the age, but it came to have a real totemic power for the opponents of slavery. But the other remarkable thing about the trial of John Brown is that it produced two more remarkable speeches. 3 speeches came out of this trial, one during the trial, 2 afterwards, in response to the trial. One actually while the trial was still going on, but the speech was given a long way away in Massachusetts, which are among the greatest speeches of the 19th century and contain within them passages of spoken prose which are among the most extraordinary ever written or spoken. 2 more speeches that are up there with the greatest speeches of them all. One was delivered by Henry Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, the author of Walden, the author of the great essay on civil disobedience that I talked about in an earlier series of this podcast. Walden, who was a transcendentalist, a great abolitionist, a passionate opponent of slavery, as were many people in Concord, Massachusetts, where he gave this speech, and where many of John Brown's supporters resided. There was a group in Concord who were thought to be behind the Harper's Ferry raid, and there was a suspicion that the heart of the conspiracy was in Concord, Massachusetts. On the 30th of October, while Brown's trial was still going on in West Virginia, Thoreau gave a speech in Concord about John Brown, about why he was one of the greatest men of the age and why his trial was confirming that, and the inevitable result of his trial, about which Thoreau, no more than anyone else, was in any doubt. He was going to be executed. Why that would confirm it. It's a excoriating speech. He really takes it to the people for whom he has utter contempt. But those people are not the slave owners, the slave holders. Those people are not the people who are trying John Brown in West Virginia and going to condemn him. The people that Thoreau can barely contain his contempt for are the people of the North, who can watch what John Brown has done and the fate that John Brown is about to suffer and think it has nothing to do with them, and think that slavery and the war against slavery is not their fight. And in this speech, Thoreau is beyond contemptuous. So I'm just going to, again, read some passages from this speech because they have to be heard in full. This is Thoreau paying tribute to John Brown. He did not go to the college called Harvard, good old alma mater as she is. He was not fed on the pap that is there furnished. As he phrased it, I know no more of grammar than one of your calves. But he went to the great university of the West, where he sedulously pursued the study of liberty, for which he had early betrayed a fondness, and having taken many degrees, he finally commenced the public practice of humanity in Kansas, as you all know. Such were his humanities, and not any study of grammar. He would have left a Greek accent slanting the wrong way and righted up a falling man. The educated elites of the North, the men of Harvard, fed the pap there. They were Thoreau's enemy in this speech. And the thing that he hated more than anything else was the ability of these men, of his audience, to lap up the news of John Brown's trial, to read it in the newspapers, to be interested in it, maybe to be moved by it, to be intrigued by it, and to think it had nothing to do with them, and then to go back to the thing that they were really interested in, which was gossip and politics and who's up and who's down, and to pay attention, more attention, to the words of politicians, including politicians like Abraham Lincoln, than the words of John Brown. Thoreau said, "To turn from the voices and deeds of earnest men to the cackling of political conventions, office seekers, and speech makers who do not so much as lay an honest egg. Their great game is the game of straws." And that phrase, the game of straws, not the Game of Thrones, but the game of straws, is the perfect phrase for Thoreau to capture what he felt about the politics of the age. There was something meaningful going on in the courtroom where John Brown was being tried, and there was nothing really meaningful happening in all of these political conventions, these newspapers, these speeches, these contests for office among men who were willing to tolerate the continuation of slavery. But then in this speech, there is a passage which I've never read anything like it. I can't imagine what it would have been like to hear it. I don't think there's anything quite like it in the English language. I would love to know if there is. And I'm going to read this passage in full. This is about what's going to happen to John Brown, and it speaks for itself. Thoreau said in Concord, Massachusetts, on the 30th of October, 1859, 1 month and 2 days before the execution of John Brown. "This event advertises to me that there is such a fact as death, the possibility of a man's dying. It seems as if no man had ever died in America before, for in order to die, you must first have lived. I don't believe in the hearses and pools and funerals that they have had. There was no death in the case, because there had been no life. They merely rotted or sloughed off, pretty much as they had rotted or sloughed along. No temple's veil was rent, only a hole dug somewhere. Let the dead bury their dead. The best of them fairly ran down a clock. Franklin, Washington, they were let off without dying. They were merely missing one day. I hear a good many pretend that they are going to die, or that they have died for aught I know. Nonsense. I defy them to do it. They haven't got life enough in them. They'll deliquesce like fungi and keep 100 eulogists mopping the spot where they left off. Only half a dozen or so have died since the world began. Do you think that you are going to die, sir? No. There's no hope of you. You haven't got your lesson yet. You've got to stay after school. We make a needless ado about capital punishment taking lives when there is no life to take. Memento mori? We don't understand that sublime sentence, which some worthy got sculptured on his gravestone once. We've interpreted it in a grovelling, snivelling sense. We've wholly forgotten how to die. But be sure you do die, nevertheless. Do your work and finish it. If you know how to begin, you will know when to end. These men, in teaching us how to die, have at the same time taught us how to live. If this man's acts and words do not create a revival, it will be the severest possible satire on the acts and words that do. It is the best news that America has ever heard. It has already quickened the feeble pulse of the North and infused more and more generous blood into her veins and heart than any number of years of what is called commercial and political prosperity could. How many a man who was lately contemplating suicide has now something to live for? What Thoreau is saying is that John Brown is Christ, and what Thoreau is saying is that this will end in blood. And what Thoreau is saying is that America, the United States of America, its union, effectively its constitution, is a suicide note. But John Brown has shown, nonetheless, despite the fact that America is a suicide note, that there is a way to live. Many people will have been horrified by this speech, especially, I imagine, if you heard it and thought it was being spoken at you. But no one who heard it could be in any doubt that were anyone to take it even half seriously, this ends in war. And then the third great speech that came out of the trial of John Brown, which was given on the first year anniversary of his execution, in early December 1860, just a few months before the start of the Civil War, after the election, but not the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. And it was given by Frederick Douglass, the man who had known Brown, commemorating Brown a year after his death. Douglass had been implicated in the raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown and some of his followers had stayed in a house owned by Frederick Douglass in the run-up to the raid. And after it was over and had ended in, effectively, fiasco, Douglass was very afraid that he would be caught up in it, implicated in it, and might himself be brought to trial. And so he escaped. He went north, as all former slaves do when under threat, rightly do, and he went to Canada, where he could be reasonably safe from being swept up in the recriminations that followed this event, because the recriminations were unavoidable. Douglass went north, and John Brown indicated, or at least he was said to have indicated, that he was very disappointed by Frederick Douglass, that he felt let down. He thought that Douglass should have come to his aid, maybe literally to his aid, and taken part in the raid itself. Thoreau doesn't mention Douglass in his speech, but by implication, Douglass is one of the men of the North who was avoiding the logical conclusion of this, which is that to live, you have to be willing to die. And Douglass reflected on this in the year after John Brown's death. Douglass, who for a long time had campaigned against slavery in the name of nonviolence, he believed that such a violent act as slavery could only be expunged by those who were willing to do the opposite, to be the opposite of slaveholders. And that meant no violence. But he had changed his view on that, progressively changed his view, and come closer to the view that ending slavery would require physical force. And in his speech commemorating the execution of John Brown, he made clear how far he had moved. It's another extraordinary speech. It's another speech. Thoreau's speech doesn't sound anything like Abraham Lincoln, doesn't sound anything like anyone apart from a mad preacher. John Brown sounded like Lincoln, and Douglass sounds like Lincoln. He had Lincoln's ability to tell a homespun tale to make his point, and he had humour. John Brown, not a particularly humorous man, but there was something wryly satirical even in John Brown's courtroom speech when he talked about the fact that he wasn't yet old enough to have learned that God favours the well-born. But Frederick Douglass was funny. He was famously funny. He could make his audiences laugh. In this speech, he told a story to illustrate the fact that the only way that the people who owned slaves would give them up was if they were made to feel so physically uncomfortable, frightened, afraid, that they could no longer bear the tension, the strain. And he said one of the lines that's used by the defenders of slavery about slavery, and that was used after John Brown's raid, is this. John Brown said to the slaves, "Rise up," and he offered them arms, but they didn't rise up. And they refused his arms because they didn't want what he had to offer. And Douglass said, as he said in many of his writings, you cannot make any argument about slavery on the basis of the behavior of slaves, because to be enslaved is to have lost all autonomy, all dignity, all ability to make a meaningful statement about your plight. You have been completely stripped of your humanity. So you can't then say, look at these people, they don't mind. And this is how Douglass put it in that speech in December 1860. You meet a man on the sidewalk in the morning and you give him the way. He thanks you for it. You meet him again and you give him the way. And he may thank you for it, but with a little less emphasis than at first. Meet him again and give him the way, and he almost forgets to thank you for it. Meet him again and give the way, and he comes to think that you are conscious either of your inferiority or of his superiority, and he begins to claim the inside of the walk as his right. This is human nature. This is the nature of the slaveholders. Now, something must be done to make these slaveholders feel the injustice of their course. In that story, it's not hard to see what that means. You have to stand in their way. You have to push them off the way. You have to fight back. And Douglass goes on to say explicitly, these men have got comfortable thinking that this is the way things are. This is the order of things. And they must be made to sleep at night in their beds with sharpened knives by their side for fear that someone will come and cut their throats. And the only way that's going to happen is if some of them have their throats cut. He says that all it will take in the end to make them feel like this is enough men like John Brown who are willing to go there and frighten them. And my God, John Brown frightened them. Part of the reason for the vehemence of the reaction to his raid, which did nothing and achieved nothing, and in which most of the cost was borne by John Brown's side, it was his son who died, was that it really frightened them. And Frederick Douglass says, send 1,000 men to the south, let them live in caves in the hills and come down at night. And sow terror. These men, though he doesn't use this word, would be terrorists. Let them do that, he said. Let, I say, only 1,000 men be scattered in those hills, and slavery is dead. It cannot live in the presence of such a danger. Such a state of things would put an end to planting cotton. It would put an end not only to planting cotton, but to planting anything in that region. And then, in case anyone was in any doubt about what he meant, at the end of his speech, that almost the last thing he said was this: the only way to make the fugitive slave law a dead letter, that was the law that said slaves that escape to the north can be recaptured by slave catchers. The only way to make the fugitive slave law a dead letter is to make a few dead slave catchers. And then the report of his speech says in brackets, laughter and applause. Douglass goes on, there is no need to kill them either. Shoot them in the legs and send them to the south, living epistles of the free gospel preached here at the north. Open brackets, renewed laughter, close brackets. And a few months later, there was a civil war. Did John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the trial of John Brown, the response to the trial of John Brown cause the American Civil War? No. The American Civil War had many, many causes, of which this was by no means the most significant. The election of Abraham Lincoln was much more significant. Did the trial of John Brown and what followed help precipitate the Civil War? Yes, it did. No question in my mind, it did. And it did it because these responses of people like Thoreau and Douglass, not by any means universally shared in the North, but widely shared enough, really did frighten the South. And it looked like what Brown was saying, what Thoreau was saying, what Douglass was saying, and it is what they were saying, is we will not play the game anymore, the game of straws. We are not going to dance around the fact that this is intolerable. We are not going to do politics through this Constitution that allows slavery in a way that pretends there is a solution to this problem in the terms of the game of straws. We are calling time on the game, and we are going to replace it with a different game, which is the game of blood. And for many people in the South, this was clear enough that they decided that if the North was going to stop playing the game, they would stop playing it first. It wasn't that people like Brown and Thoreau and Douglass were seceding from the Union, but they weren't far off seceding from the Union. The Union was, as currently constituted, at least without better men to enact its provisions, a suicide note. So before the North could pull the plug, the South pulled the plug. And the trial of John Brown had something to do with that. Lincoln went out of his way to distance himself from John Brown. He was terrified in the run-up to his presidential election that people would associate him with John Brown, and he was very happy to state that John Brown was a madman. Lincoln was nothing like John Brown. Lincoln played the game of straws. He played it amazingly well, and he fleshed it out. He made it real. It wasn't a game of straws in Lincoln's hands. It was something else. And in the end, it led to liberation. But in 1859 and through 1860, no one should think that Lincoln wanted to go down the John Brown route. So why did the election of Abraham Lincoln go with the trial and execution of John Brown in precipitating the secession of the South? Lincoln didn't say he wanted to break up the Union. Lincoln was there to save the Union. Lincoln was not a secessionist. But then, as John Brown made clear, he was not a secessionist. He was not an insurrectionist. He was just a slave freer. Lincoln said he was not a slave freer. He was no John Brown. But John Brown had said he was not there to end the game, the political game that had been fought through the 1850s and which the South feared it might be losing. It's one thing to think you might be losing the game. It's another thing to think that the other side may no longer be interested in playing that game. And that was what Lincoln and John Brown, in their very, very different ways, seemed to have in common. And then there's something else which doesn't get commented on. I'm sure it's been commented on somewhere, but I couldn't find it. But I was really struck by it, reading about and thinking about John Brown and his trial and the words that were spoken, which is a pair of images. The thing about Abraham Lincoln is that he looked like John Brown. So look them up. John Brown, before the raid on Harper's Ferry, grew a beard to help disguise himself as he was going about making the plans. He was well known. His image was well known, but he was a beardless man. And then he grew this great bushy beard that made him look like an Old Testament prophet and a classic patriarch. But that was not his look. His original look for almost all of his life was beardless, clean-shaven, gaunt, haunted, a kind of prairie man, looked like he'd been burned and burned out by the sun and the wind, staring eyes, biblical looking. He looked like a preacher man. Full head of hair, stern. Abraham Lincoln also didn't have a beard before he became president. He grew the beard. The story is a girl wrote him a letter and said you'd look better with a beard, and so he grew one. That your face is too stern and forbidding, doesn't capture what we know of you, which is that you're a good guy. And so he grew the beard, and then he became the Abraham Lincoln that we tend to think of, the bearded Lincoln. But for most of his life, he had no beard, and there are many photos of him. And if you get a photo of Lincoln and Brown at the same age, Brown was 10 years older. But if you get photos of them in their 40s or in their early 50s, both beardless, God, they look similar. Maybe when you look close, it's not so similar, but they look similar. Abraham Lincoln was gaunt, quite haunted looking. He looked like he'd been weather beaten. He had that slightly prophetic look about him. He looked like a preacher man. He wasn't a preacher man. John Brown was a preacher man. I mean, he wasn't the John Brown kind of preacher man. They look very similar. This was the dawn of the age of photography. These images were known, not widely known, but known. I have a feeling that many people in the South, when they saw Abraham Lincoln, saw John Brown, the look of him. The look of him feels like the sort of man who could give that speech that Brown gave at his trial. And it is the look of the sort of man who could give a very different, but not completely different speech, the Gettysburg Address, 4 years later. And yet, Lincoln and Brown were not the same person at all. To see that would be to make a mistake. Lincoln was there to prevent war initially, if he could, or at least to fight the fight in a way that was not just the old game of straws, but was also not complete abandonment of that game. But when the South looked at Abraham Lincoln, they thought they saw their nemesis, because their nemesis looked like John Brown, who was their nemesis. And the South in seeing Lincoln as their nemesis, made him so. A reminder that if you would like to join us for any of the screenings in our autumn season at the Regent Street Cinema in London, Films of Ideas, with a special series of guests, you can find out all the details of the films, the guests, and how to get tickets on our website, ppfideas.com. Just click on the events page. It's all there. Next time in Politics on Trial, the third in a trio of epic American trials. This is going to be the case of the Haymarket 8, convicted in 1886 of a terrorist outrage. 8 men, 1 crime, they didn't do it. It's the story of how conspiracy theorizing entered the American courtroom. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.